In the forgotten corners of American history, there are stories that defy easy categorization. They are not merely ghost stories, nor are they simple accounts of tragedy or madness. They are whispers of events that seem to tear at the very fabric of our understanding, leaving behind a silence more profound than any scream. These tales are often buried in dusty local archives, mentioned only in passing in brittle, water-stained letters, or preserved in the fragmented folklore of dying communities. They exist in the periphery of recorded history, like a word on the tip of the tongue that you can never quite recall. Where are you watching from? Comment your city and country below so we can see how far these stories are traveling. And don't forget to subscribe. New spine-chilling tales are coming soon, and you won't want to miss a single one. Today, we look into one such account, a story that, if true, suggests that there are transformations far more terrifying than death, and that sometimes the greatest horror is not an ending, but a new and incomprehensible beginning. This is the story of a boy named Samuel Miller, in the final, chilling sermon of a priest who witnessed his evolution. This is the case file of what has come to be known as the final sermon of Father Glass, a tragedy that unfolded in the lost township of Silas Croft. Our story takes place in 1886. In the township of Silas Croft, to call it a town would be an overstatement. It was, more accurately, a pocket of existence, a clot of stubborn life nestled deep within the unforgiving foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Carved out of the ancient, grasping woods, Silas Croft was a place defined by its isolation, a single, often impassable dirt road, a muddy artery prone to seasonal collapse. Connected it to the wider world, its 70-odd residents were in no hurry to join. The nearest real town was a 3-day journey by horse, a journey few ever made. Their world was bounded by the shadow of Sentinel Peak to the east and the churning, black waters of the Serpent's Tooth Creek to the west. This was a place where the forest was not just a resource. It was a living entity, an ever-present witness that pressed in on all sides, its silence older and more profound than any prayer. Life here was hard, simple, and governed by two unassailable forces, the rhythm of the seasons and the Word of God. The community was a tapestry woven from threads of piety, hard-won resilience, superstition, and a deep-seated distrust of anything that came from outside. They believed in portents, seen in the flight of crows, and remedies, whispered down from grandmothers. Beliefs that coexisted uneasily with the stern Calvinist doctrine preached on Sundays. Their world was small, but it was ordered. At the very center of this order, both geographically and spiritually, stood a modest, white-steepled church built from the very trees its presence defied, and within it a man of God who was, perhaps, more thoughtful and learned than his congregation required. Father Thomas Glass was not native to the mountains. He had come from a seminary in Boston some 15 years prior, a man of letters and quiet contemplation who had been assigned this remote parish after a quiet disagreement with his superiors over matters of theological nuance. He was respected, if not always fully understood. While his flock saw the world in stark terms of good and evil, sin and salvation, Father Glass saw nuance. His journals, the primary source for this account, are filled not with fire and brimstone, but with meditations on the unique botany of the region, detailed astronomical charts, and quiet struggles with the nature of faith in a world so full of silent, beautiful indifference. He was a man of reason and faith, who believed the two could coexist in harmony. He had not yet encountered something that would force him to question the very foundations of both. And then there was Samuel Miller, the only son of the town blacksmith, Jedediah Miller, and his wife, Sarah. Samuel was by all accounts a profoundly ordinary and deeply innocent child of 8. He was quiet, gentle, known more for his tendency to rescue fallen nestlings and splint their wings with twigs and twine than for any boisterous play. He was the kind of child that a community like Silas Croft saw as a blessing, pious and pure. He was a blank slate upon which the town could project its hopes for continuity, for a future as simple and ordered as its past. His father was a man of stoic silence and immense physical strength. His mother, a woman of quiet, fervent faith. Samuel was their still point, their shared hope, that this idyllic, if Spartan, balance was maintained for years. Father Glass tended to his flock, the millers raised their gentle son. The seasons turned, the forest watched, and then came the summer of 1886, a summer of suffocating heat and strange silent thunderstorms that split the sky with light but brought no rain. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled of ozone and damp earth. It was on one such afternoon in late July, under a bruised purple sky, that the first thread of this carefully woven reality was pulled. The incident, as it was first recorded, was tragically simple. Samuel, chasing a vibrant blue butterfly species Father Glass had never seen before and noted in his journal as a morpha, a creature impossibly far from its native southern climes, ventured closer to the Serpent's Tooth Creek at the edge of his family's property than he was allowed. The creek, swollen with phantom rains from higher in the mountains, was a churning torrent of black water. It was a place the old folks warned of, not just for the rapids, but for the feeling it gave you a sense of ancient cold that had nothing to do with the water temperature. A place where sound seemed to die. In his boyish excitement, his eyes fixed on the impossible blue of the butterfly's wings, he slipped on the moss-licked black stones that lined the bank. The fall was awkward. His head struck something sharp and unseen beneath the churning surface, and the current, swift and merciless, pulled him under. It was several minutes before his mother's frantic cries brought help. Jedediah Miller, working at his forge, heard the scream and moved with a speed no one had ever seen in the stoic man. He plunged into the raging creek without hesitation. When he finally pulled Samuel's limp body from the water, it was clear that the worst had happened. The boy was pale, unbreathing, his limbs trailing like a doll's. A deep, oddly shaped gash marred his temple. The town's physician, a self-taught man named Silas Croft, who practiced medicine from a 20-year-old textbook, was summoned. After a grim, prolonged examination, he pronounced the boy dead from drowning and a severe blow to the head. His notes, later recovered, stated, "No respiration, no pulse discernible, pupils fixed and dilated. Lividity already beginning to set in. Time of death, approx 3:15 post-meridium." The grief that descended upon Silas Croft was palpable, a physical weight that seemed to thicken the already heavy air. The loss of a child was the ultimate tragedy, a disruption of the natural order that shook the community to its core. Father Glass was called to the Miller home to offer last rites and comfort the inconsolable parents. He describes the scene in his journal, his words heavy with a sorrow that is purely human, entirely familiar. Journal of Father Thomas Glass, July 28, 1886. Asterisk, I have today performed the saddest of my duties. Young Samuel Miller has been taken from us. His mother's wails are a sound I fear will never leave my memory, a sound more terrible than any storm. I looked upon the boy, laid out on the family's dining table, and felt the profound injustice of the world. So much light extinguished by a moment's carelessness, by the allure of a pretty insect. There was a peculiar contusion on his temple, a deep and oddly patterned bruise, almost geometric in its precision. Elias said he must have struck one of the sharp, black stones in the creek bed. I prayed for his soul, but my prayers felt hollow, a pathetic shield against a universe of cold, random chance. Samuel's body was prepared for burial. He was washed and dressed in his Sunday best, and laid in a small pine coffin his father had built with trembling hands, the hammer blows echoing through the silent town. The wake was held that evening. The small Miller cabin was filled with grieving townspeople, their faces grim in the flickering candlelight, the air thick with the scent of pine, beeswax, and sorrow. And it is here that the story pivots from a recognizable tragedy into something else entirely. According to the dozen or so witnesses present, at approximately 2 hours past sundown, as the mourners sat in somber silence, a sound came from the coffin. It was a faint, wet, rasping noise. A gasp. Minds in the grip of grief can play tricks. The initial reaction was dismissal, a shared, unspoken agreement that they had imagined it, a trick of the wind, a settling of the house. But then it came again, louder this time, a sharp, ragged intake of breath, followed by a weak, sputtering cough that echoed in the deathly quiet room. Panic and disbelief warred in the small crowded space. Mr. Miller, his face a mask of horrified hope, lunged forward and threw open the coffin lid. What they saw would be forever seared into the memory of Silas Croft. Samuel Miller, the boy who had been submerged for minutes, the boy who had been declared dead for over 6 hours, was stirring. His eyes, still closed, fluttered. Water, brackish and foul, smelling of deep rot and cold stone, trickled from the corner of his mouth. And then his chest rose and fell in a deep, shuddering, miraculous breath. The shockwave that hit the community was seismic. Grief was instantly replaced by euphoric, terrified awe. Dr. Croft rushed to the boy's side, his medical knowledge utterly useless in the face of what he was witnessing. He could find no explanation. The boy was breathing. His heart was beating. It was impossible. It was a miracle. Father Glass, who had been leading a prayer, was struck dumb. He describes his own reaction with unnerving honesty in an addendum to his journal entry, written late that night with a shaking hand. Journal of Father Thomas Glass, July 28, 1886. Addendum, * God has shown us his power. Samuel lives. I write these words and still cannot comprehend them. The boy breathes. He has returned from the very jaws of death. The town is electrified with holy fervor. They call it the miracle of Silas Croft. I, too, am overcome with a profound sense of divine intervention. And yet, there is a sliver of ice in my soul, a cold, analytical part of my mind that I cannot silence. It asks a question I am too afraid to even write down. When a vessel has been empty for so long, what is it, exactly, that fills it again? The event that came to be called the miracle of Silas Croft transformed the town. The oppressive grief was lifted, replaced by a zealous, almost manic piety. The church was fuller than it had ever been. Samuel Miller became a living saint, a testament to the power of their faith. He remained in a deep, sleep-like state for 3 days and 3 nights. Laid in his own bed now, the hastily built coffin stored in the barn like a strange relic. Dr. Croft monitored him, his reports to Father Glass growing increasingly bewildered. The boy's vitals were not just stable, they were perfect, too perfect. His breathing was as regular as a pendulum. His heart beat with a metronomic consistency that was, in Croft's words, unnatural for any living creature, man or beast. Croft also noted that the boy's skin, despite the warmth of the room, remained stubbornly cool to the touch. The strange, geometric wound on his temple healed at an impossible rate, leaving behind not a scar, but a patch of skin that seemed smoother and paler than the rest, almost translucent. On the morning of the 4th day, Samuel awoke. He sat up, his movements fluid and precise, not stiff or weak as one would expect. He looked around the room at his tearfully joyous parents, and then his gaze settled on the patchwork quilt his mother had made. His expression was unreadable. He spoke his first words since his return, his voice flat and devoid of its childish lilt. "The geometry is inefficient," he said, tracing one of the squares on the quilt. "The patterns repeat, but they do not progress." His parents, the strange utterance to the lingering trauma, simply embraced him, weeping with relief. But for Father Glass, who was present, those 3 words were the first toll of a distant, dissonant bell. The geometry is inefficient. It was not the confused rambling of a recovering child. It was delivered with a clarity and a detached, observational tone that was deeply unsettling. In the weeks that followed, Samuel's recovery continued to defy all explanation. Physically, he appeared to be the same boy, but the people closest to him, his parents, Father Glass, and the few other children who dared approach him, began to notice subtle, yet profound, alterations. The changes were small at first, easily dismissed, easily rationalized away as quirks of his ordeal. But they began to accumulate, like dust settling in a sealed room, until their collective weight became impossible to ignore. The first and most persistent change was in his eyes. In normal light, they were the same gentle brown they had always been. But in the dim twilight of the cabin, or in the low glow of candlelight, they seemed to hold a faint, internal luminescence, a phosphorescence, like that of deep-sea creatures, or a foxfire on rotting wood that seemed to emanate from some place far behind the pupil. It wasn't a reflection, it was a source. His parents told themselves it was a trick of the light, but Father Glass saw it too. He recorded it in his journal, his language shifting from pastoral to almost clinical. Journal of Father Thomas Glass. August 15th, 1886. I visited the Millers this evening. Samuel was sitting by the fire, carving a piece of wood. The way the firelight caught in his eyes was peculiar. It did not seem to be a reflection. It was as if the light was not bouncing off the surface, but being drawn in, processed, and emitted back, changed. There is a coldness there now, a depth that I find I cannot meet for more than a moment. It is like looking into a well and seeing stars instead of a reflection. I saw his mother flinch when he looked at her. We did not speak of it. Then came the changes in his physicality. The old Samuel had been a typically clumsy boy, old scraped knees and fumbled catches. The new Samuel moved with an impossible, unnerving grace. His coordination was not just improved, it was flawless, economical, and utterly without hesitation. His mother would drop a spindle, and Samuel, without even looking up from his book, would extend a hand and catch it just before it hit the floor. He could walk along the thinnest rail of a fence, balance on a rolling log in the river, his movements as certain and precise as a master watchmaker's. He began to whittle, and the objects he created were baffling. Wooden birds with feathers, carved to a microscopic thinness, and strange interlocking puzzles that seemed to have no solution and no beginning. This new prowess was a source of pride for his father, but it disturbed Father Glass. It was not the earned grace of an athlete. It was something else. It was the efficiency of a machine, devoid of the small human imperfections of trial and error. There was no joy in his movements, only purpose. But the most terrifying changes were not physical, but intellectual. Samuel, a boy who had struggled with his letters and basic arithmetic, began to display knowledge that he could not possibly possess. He would sit in the dirt and sketch complex, multi-layered geometric patterns with the stick shapes that seemed to twist and fold in on themselves in ways that violated the known principles of Euclidean space. They were not demonic sigils or pagan symbols. They were something colder, more alien. They were diagrams of an impossible mathematics, beautiful and horrifying. Father Glass, his own education in classical geometry, now feeling like a child's primer, tried to question him about the drawings. One afternoon, he found the boy sketching a particularly complex figure in the dust of the smithy. "Samuel, what is it that you are drawing?" The priest asked gently. Samuel didn't look up. His voice was a monotone, devoid of childish inflection. A pathway, a simpler way to connect to points without traversing the space between. A pathway to where? Father Glass pressed, his heart beginning to beat faster. Samuel finally stopped drawing and looked up. For a moment, the golden lattice in his eyes was clearly visible. Not to a where, to a when, and where and when are the same thing. You just perceive them in sequence. It's inefficient. Father Glass was a man of God. His first instinct, buried under layers of modern rationalism, was to consider demonic possession. This was the framework his faith provided for such an anomaly. He began to subtly test this hypothesis. He would speak the name of Jesus Christ in Samuel's presence. The boy showed no reaction, no more than if he'd mentioned the weather. He would bless the water that Samuel drank. It had no effect. One afternoon, in the Miller cabin, he pressed his own personal rosary, a simple wooden thing he had carried for 20 years, into Samuel's hand. The boy did not recoil in pain or scream. Instead, he examined it with a serene, detached curiosity. He traced the shape of the crucifix with his finger. "A powerful symbol," Samuel said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Two intersecting lines, a finite representation of a third axis, extending into a dimension you cannot perceive. It is a shadow of a greater truth, a projection. Very clever. Primitive, but clever." He handed it back to Father Glass. The priest's blood ran cold. This was not the language of a demon, which would mock or defile the holy object. This was the language of a higher order observer, analyzing a primitive artifact with polite, intellectual interest. It was the moment Father Glass realized that he was not dealing with an enemy of his God, but with something that existed entirely outside of that paradigm. His frameworks were failing. His faith, his reason, they were, like trying to measure the ocean with a thimble. The town, for its part, remained largely blind, wrapped in the warm cloak of their miracle. They saw the boy's strange new abilities as gifts from the Almighty. His unnerving knowledge was proof of his divine touch. They had their miracle, and they would not let it be questioned. But whispers began to circulate. Whispers about the glow in Samuel's eyes, about how he never seemed to sleep, but would sit by the window all night staring at the stars, about how the animals on the Miller farm, the chickens, the mule, even the family dog, had grown skittish and silent in his presence, refusing to come near him. The awe was beginning to curdle, just slightly. At the edges, Father Glass's journal entries from this period become a frantic, desperate chronicle of his dissolving certainty. He was a man adrift, his maps of reality rendered useless. Journal of Father Thomas Glass, September 20th, 1886. *** Possession is not the right word. Possession implies a struggle, a host fighting an invader. There is no struggle in Samuel. The boy I knew, the gentle, simple child, is gone. I do not mean he is dead. I mean he has been overwritten. The pages have been scraped clean, and a new, incomprehensible text has been written in his place. He speaks of star patterns visible only from the southern hemisphere. He described to me, in perfect detail, the way a fly's compound eye perceives light. He asked me why we live on the surface of our world, instead of within the more stable folds of its temporal curvature. I tried to speak to him of sin and salvation. He listened patiently, the way one might listen to a child's fairy tale, and then asked me if a thought could have a shape. My theology is a child's toy. My fear is no longer of the devil. I fear we have been noticed by something else, something that does not hate us, something that, I suspect, does not think of us at all. By the full harvest moon of autumn, 1886, the fragile peace in Silas Croft was beginning to fracture. The miracle boy was becoming the strange boy. The initial euphoria had evaporated, leaving a residue of deep, gnawing unease. The subtle changes in Samuel Miller were becoming more pronounced, more difficult to rationalize away. The suppressed horror that had been simmering beneath the surface of the community was now beginning to boil over. The transformation was accelerating. Samuel's physical gifts evolved from merely unnerving to overtly impossible. One blustery afternoon, several women from the town were gossiping by the general store. They watched as Samuel walked down the main dirt road toward the church. At the exact same moment, the blacksmith, Jedediah Miller, and two other men swore they saw Samuel standing perfectly still in the hayloft of their barn, over half a mile away, staring out the window toward Sentinel Peak. Both accounts were adamant, given by sober, God-fearing people. It was not a case of mistaken identity. In a town as small as Silas Croft, such a thing was impossible. The boy had, for a moment, appeared to exist in two places at once. Another incident was even more disturbing. Dr. Croft, his scientific curiosity finally outweighing his fear, was persuaded by Father Glass to attempt one last medical examination. As he listened to the boy's chest with his stethoscope, he went pale and recoiled as if struck. He later reported to the priest, his voice trembling, that he had heard not one, but two distinct heartbeats, one overlaid on the other. One was the steady metronomic beat he'd noted before. The other was faster, arrhythmic, and seemed to be beating in a complex, mathematical cadence that matched the sequence of prime numbers. Croft fled the Miller house that day, muttering about acoustic impossibilities, and never returned. The final illusion of the innocent boy was shattered in an event involving a stray dog. The animal, its leg horrifically mangled in a trap, had dragged itself into the center of town, whimpering piteously. The townsfolk were about to put it out of its misery when Samuel approached. He did not show the gentle pity he once would have, but a kind of detached, scientific curiosity. He knelt, placing a hand on the dog's mangled leg. The townspeople who witnessed it said a faint, golden light shot through with flickering lines of light like a diagram, enveloped his hand for a moment. The dog, which had been unable to move, stood up. Its leg was healed, but it was not a perfect, divine healing. The bones had not just been mended, they had been reconfigured. The leg now bent at an impossible, backward angle, like a bird's, but with a secondary joint that allowed it to rotate a full 360 degrees. The dog did not seem to be in pain. It trotted away, its gait a grotesque, spiraling corkscrew, a living perversion of natural biology. The horror was now manifest. This was not the healing power of God. This was an act of restructuring, an act of rewriting reality according to a new, alien logic. The town could no longer deny what was in front of them. Their miracle had become a monster. Fear, that most ancient and powerful of motivators, took root. The whispers turned to accusations. The townsfolk, their simple worldview threatened, reverted to their most primal understanding of such things. They had been deceived. This was not a miracle of God, but a trick of the devil. They needed a solution. They needed an exorcism. A delegation of town elders, led by Samuel's own terrified father, went to Father Glass. They found him a changed man. He was gaunt, his eyes wide with sleeplessness, his study littered with books not only on theology, but on astronomy, advanced mathematics, and theoretical physics tomes he had ordered from the city months before. The pages filled with his frantic, scrawled notes. The elders demanded he perform the rites of exorcism and cast the demon out of Samuel Miller. Father Glass looked at them with an expression they could only describe as profound, pitying exhaustion. His response, recorded by one of the elders, in a letter to his brother, was the turning point in this entire saga. We told him he must act, that the devil was in the Miller boy. Father Glass just shook his head slowly. You are using the wrong words, he told us. You are trying to describe the color blue to a man born blind. There is no demon in that boy, because the concept of a demon is too small for what has happened. He pointed to his books, to a page with a complex diagram. Do you know what a tesseract is? It is a four-dimensional cube. If it were to pass through our three-dimensional world, what would we see? We would see shifting, changing shapes. A cube, then other stranger forms, appearing and disappearing. From nothing, we would not understand what we were looking at. We would call it a monster. We would call it a demon. He looked at us, and his eyes. God help me. His eyes were full of a terror far deeper than our own. Samuel did not fall into the creek, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He fell through it. He fell through the skin of the world, and what came back is not possessed. It is expanded. The town elders did not understand his geometric analogies, or his talk of dimensions. They understood only that their priest was refusing to help them. They saw his intellectualism as heresy, his fear as cowardice. The trust between the shepherd and his flock was broken. They left his study convinced that the Father himself was either mad or in league with the very evil they sought to destroy. Left, alone, Father Glass descended into the final stages of his intellectual and spiritual crisis. He understood now. The entity that wore Samuel's face was not malevolent. Malice is a human concept. It was simply different, a being of higher complexity, experiencing our limited reality. The impossible geometry Samuel drew, the extra heartbeat, the ability to be in two places at once, these weren't supernatural tricks. They were the natural attributes of a four-dimensional being, imperfectly manifesting in a three-dimensional space. The miracle of his healing was not a restoration of life. It was the installation of a new and far more complex operating system. And, the most terrifying part, the part that shattered Father Glass's soul, was the realization of its irreversibility. You cannot exercise knowledge. You cannot cast out a higher state of being. You cannot convince a sphere to become a circle again. The boy, Samuel Miller, was an echo, a memory stored within a vessel that now contained an awareness as vast and as cold as interstellar space. He sought out the boy one last time. He found him not at home, but standing in the center of a clearing deep in the woods, a place the townsfolk avoided, believing it to be haunted. Samuel was not doing anything. He He was simply standing, head tilted to the sky, as if listening to a silent broadcast. "Samuel," Father Glass called out, his voice trembling. "What are you doing out here?" Samuel turned his head slowly. His face was calm. His eyes glowed with a soft, steady golden light now, even in the daylight. "Waiting," he said. "The aperture is almost aligned. Soon there will be resonance." "Resonance? What are you talking about? Can you hear me, Samuel? Is any part of the boy I knew still in there?" Samuel took a step towards him. The forest floor around him seemed to shimmer, the very air seeming to bend slightly around his form. "The boy you knew is a foundation, a lovely, simple pattern upon which a cathedral is being built. You should not mourn the foundation. You should be in awe of the cathedral. The cathedral is not made of stone and wood. It is made of moments and possibilities." As he spoke, Father Glass swore he could see, for a split second, the boy's features blur and rearrange into a dizzying array of impossible angles and light before snapping back into the familiar face he so desperately wanted to see. Father Glass fled. He ran not from a monster, but from a truth his mind could not contain. He barricaded himself in the church, not to pray for deliverance, but to write, to document, to try and forge a new language for a new kind of horror. He knew the town's fear was reaching a critical mass. He knew they would act violently and ignorantly, and he knew he had one last duty to perform, not as a priest trying to save his flock, but as a chronicler, a witness to the end of one world and the beginning of another. He announced he would deliver a special sermon that Sunday, the final sermon. The town understood this as a call to arms, a final confrontation. They began to sharpen their tools and their resolve. They were coming to church not for salvation, but for war. Sunday, October 31st, 1886, All Hallows Eve, the day Father Thomas Glass chose to deliver his final sermon. The air in Silas Croft was thick with more than just the autumn chill. It was electric with fear, anticipation, and a grim, communal purpose. The entire town converged on the church as the sun rose, a gray and foreboding dawn. They did not come with open hearts, but with clenched fists. The men carried farm implements, pitchforks, scythes, axes, their intended use, unspoken, but universally understood. Their faces were stone, their eyes burning with the righteous fury of the terrified. They filled the pews, a silent, menacing congregation. At the very front, sitting alone in the pew once reserved for his family, was Samuel Miller. His parents were not with him. They had, according to later reports, locked themselves in their home. Torn between love for the son they remembered and terror of the thing he had become, Samuel sat perfectly still, his posture unnaturally straight. He looked at the altar with his placid, faintly glowing eyes, a point of serene calm in a sea of simmering violence. Then Father Glass emerged. The man who stood at the pulpit was barely recognizable as the thoughtful, scholarly priest they had known. He was a specter, his clothes hanging from his skeletal frame, his face a mask of profound, transcendent horror. His eyes were not wild with madness, but lucid with a clarity that was somehow more frightening. He did not look at his congregation. He looked at Samuel, and then he began to speak, his voice thin but carrying in the dead silence. "I see you have come here for a battle. You have brought your tools of harvest and turned them into weapons. You have come to fight a devil, to cast out a demon. You have come for an exorcism." He paused, letting the words hang in the dead air. "There will be no exorcism. To perform one would be like trying to shout a storm into silence. It is a fool's errand. You believe you are fighting an enemy. You are not. You are children throwing stones at a tidal wave, hoping to turn it back. Your fear, your anger, they are meaningless. You are afraid of the dark, but the thing you should fear is a light so bright it will burn your minds to ash." A murmur ran through the congregation. Jedediah Miller, standing in the aisle, gripped his blacksmith's hammer tighter. "For 15 years, I have spoken to you of God," Father Glass continued. "A loving God, a wrathful God, a shepherd who watches over his flock. I taught you what I was taught. A simple, comforting story for a simple, comforting world. I was wrong. Not wrong in that God does not exist, but wrong in our assumption that we are the only flock, that this small, muddy pasture is the only one in a universe of infinite fields. He gestured, not at Samuel, but at the very walls of the church, at the sky beyond the windows. We are flatlanders, living on a plane of paper. We understand length and width, but not height. We have lived our lives unaware of the third dimension that exists all around us. Now, a sphere has passed through our world. To us, it appeared, first as a single point, then a growing and shrinking circle, and then nothing. It is an event so far beyond our comprehension that we can only call it monster or miracle, but it is neither. It is simply geometry. He now looked directly at Samuel, his expression one of awe and pity. That boy, Samuel. He did not drown in the creek. He fell through it. He touched something on the other side. A place where the rules that govern our reality are suggestions. He is not possessed. He has been shown the third dimension. He is no longer a circle. He is a sphere. And he has come back to a world of paper, a world that can no longer contain him. As he spoke, a low hum began to fill the church, seeming to emanate from Samuel himself, a faint, golden geometric pattern, like the one Samuel drew in the dirt, projected from the boy and shimmered on the wall behind the altar. It slowly, hypnotically rotated, folding in on itself in impossible ways. You want to kill the boy? You want to destroy the vessel. It is like wanting to kill a shadow. The act is meaningless because the source of it is elsewhere. The boy you knew, the memory of Samuel, is a gift. It is the only reason this being still maintains a form you can recognize. It is an act of translation, an act of politeness. The hum grew louder. The light from Samuel intensified. The projected geometry on the wall became more complex, folding into itself. The townsfolk were now terrified, their anger giving way to primal fear. Some began to cry out. Father Glass raised his hands, not in blessing, but in resignation. His voice rose to a final, shattering crescendo. So I say to you, put down your weapons. They are toys. Put down your holy books. Their words are too small. Look upon this new Genesis. Look upon the cathedral being built from the foundation of your son, and know that your world has become a footnote in a history you will never be able to read. This is not a sermon of salvation. It is a eulogy for the primacy of man. Accounts of what happened next are fractured, contradictory, and drenched in hysteria. As Father Glass spoke his final word, the light from Samuel Miller allegedly filled the entire church, a blinding golden lattice of impossible shapes that seemed to contain colors for which there are no names. The humming intensified into a deafening, soul-shaking chord that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in the bones, in the fillings of teeth. Some claimed the very walls of the church seemed to become transparent, revealing not the forest outside, but a swirling vista of stars and nebulae, of colliding galaxies and the birth of suns. Then there was silence and darkness when the first outsiders, a pair of fur trappers, reached Silas Croft. Months later, in the spring of 1887, alerted by a lack of any trade or communication, they found a ghost town. It was not burned. It was not ravaged by plague. It was simply empty. The houses were silent, doors swinging in the wind, tables set for meals that were never eaten. The Miller house was empty, the parents gone. The blacksmith's forge was cold, a half-finished horseshoe on the anvil. The church was undisturbed. Inside, Father Glass's journal lay open on the pulpit. The final page contained a single, hastily scrawled entry under the date October 31st. It read, "The resonance is achieved. The cathedral is open. The paper has learned to fold." Of the congregation, of Father Thomas Glass, of the boy Samuel Miller, there was no trace. Not a single body was ever found. The entire population of Silas Croft had vanished from the face of the earth. The official explanation, written into the county records, was a mass disappearance, likely the result of a sudden exodus or a localized, undocumented plague that caused the survivors to flee and scatter, never to return. Silas Croft was erased from the maps. The forest reclaimed the land, but local legends persist. Stories told in hushed tones in the towns miles away. Stories of a lost village that simply winked out of existence. They say that on certain nights, especially around Halloween, if you hike deep enough into the mountains to where Silas Croft once stood, you can sometimes see strange lights, not the flickering of lanterns or the glow of a fire, but silent, geometric patterns of golden light that dance and fold among the trees, tracing the outlines of an architecture that does not belong here. What truly happened in that church on October 31st, 1886, was Father Glass a madman who incited a mass hysteria that led his flock to some unknown, tragic fate? Or was he a prophet, the sole witness to a paranormal or even extraterrestrial event of incomprehensible magnitude? Was Samuel Miller a victim, a monster, or something far stranger, bridge between our world and another? The story of Silas Croft leaves us with no easy answers. It leaves us only with the chilling, existential dread of Father Glass's final realization that the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. The records are sealed, the town forgotten. But a story like this doesn't truly die. It waits. It waits for someone to ask the right questions. What if Father Glass wasn't mad? What if he was the only sane man left? And if you stood in that church, faced with that choice to fight the incomprehensible or to witness it, would you have chosen differently?